cold December air whipped through the streets of Manhattan as Officer Jake Thompson stood guard outside the Capitol Club, one of New York's most exclusive establishments. His breath formed small clouds in the night air while he watched the usual parade of wealthy clientele entering the venue. At 45 years old, with 20 years on the force, Jake had spent the last 5 handling security detail at high-end locations like this one. Jake's position at the entrance gave him complete control over who entered the club. He took pride in his ability to spot trouble before it started, relying on what he called instinct, but what was really a complex web of prejudices he'd never confronted. When groups approached, he automatically categorized them. Wall Street types got immediate entry, while others faced varying degrees of scrutiny. "Keep the riffraff out," the club manager had told him on his first night. Jake had nodded, understanding the unspoken implications of that instruction. Over time, he'd developed an informal system of who belonged and who didn't, based largely on appearance and his own biases. At 10:30 p.m., a group of 6 people approached the entrance. 5 of them fit Jake's mental image of typical club patrons: expensive suits, designer watches, and confident expressions that came from old money. The 6th person, a black man in a tailored Tom Ford suit, triggered Jake's deeply ingrained prejudices despite his equally polished appearance. "ID," Jake demanded, stepping directly in front of the black man while ignoring the others. David Johnson reached for his wallet, maintaining his composure despite the obvious discrimination. His friends exchanged uncomfortable glances as Jake scrutinized the ID with exaggerated care. "This club is members only," Jake stated flatly, handing the ID back. "I'm well aware," David replied, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not just a member. I own this establishment." Jake's face flushed, but years of ingrained behavior and pride prevented him from backing down. "Anyone can say that. I'm going to need to see more proof." The situation quickly escalated as David's friends began protesting. Several phones emerged from pockets, recording the confrontation. David maintained his dignity, but refused to back down. "Officer Thompson," David said, reading Jake's nameplate, "this is exactly the kind of situation I bought this club to prevent. Call your supervisor, call the manager, do whatever you need to do. But understand that this moment will have consequences." Jake felt the control he treasured slipping away. His authority was being challenged, and his instinct was to double down. "Sir, if you don't step away from the entrance, I'll have to consider that as threatening behavior." The crowd growing around them fell silent. David's friends moved closer to him, phones still recording. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted irreversibly, though Jake hadn't yet realized it. His attempt to maintain control would instead become the catalyst for changes that would reshape both their lives. By morning, social media erupted with multiple videos of the confrontation. Capitol Club racism trended on Twitter, while surveillance footage from the club's entrance provided additional angles of Jake's discriminatory behavior. The clips spread rapidly across Instagram and Facebook, triggering widespread outrage and calls for accountability. In the precinct's conference room, Jake sat facing Police Commissioner Martinez and 3 other senior officers. The fluorescent lights seemed particularly harsh as they reviewed the footage on a mounted screen. "Officer Thompson," Martinez began, his voice tight with controlled anger, "this department has been working to rebuild community trust. One incident like this erases years of progress. What do you have to say for yourself?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his uniform feeling unusually constricting. "I was following standard security protocols." "By singling out the black owner of the establishment," Martinez interrupted. "The same protocols that let 5 white individuals pass without question?" Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse office, David Johnson paced while on a conference call with his management team. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Central Park, but his attention was focused inward. "We need to handle this strategically," David explained to his team. "I'm not interested in destroying this officer's career. We have an opportunity to create real change." His fingers drummed against his mahogany desk as he outlined his vision for an inclusion awareness event. After the meeting, David began drafting invitations to community leaders, civil rights activists, and police representatives. His assistant compiled statistics on discrimination in upscale venues, creating a compelling narrative of systemic issues that extended far beyond one incident. That evening, Jake sat alone in his modest Queens apartment, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. The TV played footage of protests gathering outside the precinct, but he barely registered it. Instead, his mind wandered to a memory from 20 years ago. His father, also a police officer, clearing out his locker after being fired for similar discriminatory behavior. "Never apologize," his father had told him that day. "The job comes first. The moment you start second-guessing yourself, you've lost." Jake picked up his phone, scrolling through hundreds of hostile messages on his social media accounts. His father's words, once a cornerstone of his police work, now felt hollow. The same righteous anger that had fueled his father's downfall was present in Jake, but something else was there too. A creeping realization that perhaps his father had been wrong. A text message from his sergeant arrived. Mandatory sensitivity training would begin tomorrow. Jake closed his eyes, feeling trapped between his father's legacy and the undeniable need for change. The weight of generations of ingrained prejudice pressed down on him, while the voice of progress demanded evolution. The whiskey remained untouched as Jake spent the night confronting uncomfortable truths about himself, his upbringing, and the system he'd sworn to serve. Outside, the city continued to buzz with outrage over the incident, unaware that both perpetrator and victim were already setting in motion changes that would reach far beyond a single night at a club entrance. The community center's basement wasn't much, just folding chairs arranged in a circle under flickering fluorescent lights. But for Jake, it became a lifeline. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the police support group met here, away from the media's scrutiny and the department's official channels. "My name is Jake," he started, his voice rougher than usual. "And I'm here because I finally realized I need help." The dozen other officers in the circle nodded, recognizing the cost of such admission. Their facilitator, Dr. Sarah Chen, a police psychologist, encouraged him to continue. "I've spent 20 years thinking I was protecting people," Jake continued, "but now I'm seeing how much harm I've actually caused." He described the incident at the Capitol Club, watching as his colleagues' expressions shifted between recognition and discomfort. Several had their own similar stories. Officer Rodriguez spoke up. "Last week, I pulled over a car in Greenwich Village. Before I even reached the window, I had assumptions about the driver. That's when I realized I was doing exactly what Jake did." Across town, in a sleek conference room overlooking Times Square, David Johnson led a different kind of meeting. Community leaders, business owners, and civil rights activists gathered around a glass table, laptops open and ideas flowing. "This isn't about shame or punishment," David explained, standing at the head of the table. "It's about creating lasting change." He shared his own journey, from a scholarship kid at Princeton to his first ventures in real estate, each step marked by encounters with prejudice. Marcus Washington, a prominent civil rights attorney, leaned forward. "We need to make this more than just another diversity seminar. These officers have sat through dozens of those." "Exactly," David agreed. "We're creating a dialogue, not delivering a lecture." He outlined his vision for the event: small group discussions, shared meals, and honest conversations about experiences on both sides of the badge. Laura Chen, a reporter from the New York Times, sat in the corner taking notes. She'd covered similar stories before, but something about this felt different. The usual anger was there, but it was channeled into something constructive. Mr. Johnson, she interrupted. What made you decide to take this approach rather than pursuing legal action? David paused, considering. Because I've been on the receiving end of discrimination my entire life. Filing lawsuits hasn't changed hearts and minds. We need a new approach. Laura's article began taking shape in her mind. Not just another story about racial profiling, but an examination of how communities might actually begin healing these deep-seated wounds. Back at the support group, Jake listened as his colleagues shared their own struggles with inherited prejudices and systemic biases. Dr. Chen guided the conversation toward understanding, rather than defensiveness. We can't change what we don't acknowledge, she reminded them, and acknowledgement is just the beginning. One officer described struggling with his partner's casual racism. Another admitted to treating white and minority suspects differently during traffic stops. Each confession created space for others to examine their own behaviors. As the session ended, Jake lingered, helping to stack chairs. Dr. Chen approached him. You're doing the hard work many aren't willing to do, she said. Keep coming back. Outside, the evening news was already promoting Laura's upcoming story. Beyond the badge, a city confronts its biases. The momentum was building toward David's event, though none of them yet knew how it would transform their understanding of justice, redemption, and community. The Capitol Club underwent a transformation for David's event. Crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead, but the usual exclusive atmosphere had been replaced by something more purposeful. Round tables filled the main floor, each deliberately set with a mix of police officers, community leaders, and local residents. Security cameras captured every angle, not for surveillance, but to document what David hoped would be a historic evening. Police Commissioner Martinez sat near the entrance, his presence sending a clear message about the department's commitment to change. Officers in uniform mingled uncomfortably with community activists, both sides maintaining cautious politeness. The air felt heavy with unspoken tensions and cautious hope. At precisely 7 p.m., David Johnson took the stage. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. He wore the same Tom Ford suit from the night of the incident, a deliberate choice that wasn't lost on the audience. Look around this room, David began, his voice steady and measured. Every person here has a story about prejudice, whether as someone who experienced it, someone who witnessed it, or someone who now realizes they perpetuated it. Tonight isn't about pointing fingers. It's about understanding why those fingers get pointed in the first place. He shared statistics about racial profiling in New York, but rather than dwelling on numbers, he focused on individual stories. He spoke about the first time he was pulled over for driving his own luxury car, about the shop owners who followed him around stores, about the doorman who questioned his residency in his own building. But I also want to talk about growth, David continued, about the doorman who became one of my closest friends after realizing his biases, about the shop owner who now partners with me in community outreach programs. Change is possible, but it requires honesty, discomfort, and courage. In the audience, Laura scribbled notes frantically. She watched faces in the crowd, some nodding in recognition, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The story was writing itself, not just about one incident of discrimination, but about a community forcing itself to confront uncomfortable truths. From his position near the back of the room, Jake listened intently. Each word hit home, forcing him to confront memories of similar situations where he'd been the one making assumptions, the one creating barriers, the one perpetuating pain. David concluded his speech by announcing a new initiative, a partnership between his businesses and the police department to create regular dialogue sessions and community engagement programs. The applause was genuine but measured, everyone understanding that real work lay ahead. After the speech, small group discussions began at each table. Facilitators guided conversations about personal experiences with discrimination, law enforcement challenges, and potential solutions. The discussions were raw, honest, and occasionally heated, but remained respectful. Laura approached David for an interview as he stepped off stage. "Your speech focused more on reconciliation than retribution," she noted. "Why?" David gestured at the room full of people engaged in difficult conversations. "Because retribution ends with punishment, but reconciliation can lead to real change. Look around. We have people talking who would never have been in the same room a month ago. That's where change begins." The evening continued with more structured discussions, personal testimonies, and even role-playing exercises designed to build empathy. As the event progressed, the initial tension began to ease, replaced by genuine engagement and understanding. The atmosphere in the club shifted noticeably when Jake Thompson stood up from his table. He hadn't been invited to speak, and several people tensed visibly as he made his way to the microphone. Security officers exchanged glances, ready to intervene if necessary, but David gave a subtle signal to let Jake proceed. Jake's police uniform, which he'd chosen to wear despite being off-duty, seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. The room fell into an uneasy silence as he gripped the podium, his knuckles white against the dark wood. "I'm Officer Jake Thompson," he began, his voice slightly unsteady. "Most of you know me as the cop from the viral video, the one who stopped Mr. Johnson from entering his own club." He paused, swallowing hard. "What you don't know is that 20 years ago, I watched my father clean out his locker after being fired for similar behavior." The silence in the room deepened. Even those who had been checking their phones looked up, caught by the raw honesty in Jake's voice. "I swore I'd be different," he continued. "I told myself I was one of the good ones, that I judged people by their actions, not their appearance. But standing here tonight, listening to everyone's stories, I realize I've been lying to myself for 20 years. Jake pulled out his father's old badge from his pocket, holding it up. This was his. He gave it to me the day he was fired, told me to keep the line. I thought he meant the line between order and chaos. Now I understand he meant something else entirely. A line that divided people based on nothing but prejudice. Some audience members shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, engaged by his unexpected vulnerability. A few officers in uniform looked down at their own badges, perhaps seeing them differently. "Mr. Johnson," Jake turned to face David directly. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth. That night, I wasn't protecting your club. I was protecting a system of exclusion that I'd been trained to maintain my entire life. And I was wrong." The response from the crowd was mixed. Some applauded his honesty, while others remained skeptical, their crossed arms and furrowed brows suggesting they viewed this as mere performance. A woman in the front row stood up, pointing her finger accusingly. "Words are easy," she challenged. "What are you actually going to do about it?" Jake nodded, acknowledging the validity of her question. "I'm starting by admitting my father was wrong, that I was wrong. I'm enrolling in implicit bias training, not because the department mandated it, but because I need it. And I'm requesting a transfer to community outreach, where I can start learning, instead of pretending I already know." David watched carefully from the side of the stage, studying the room's reaction. He saw the divisions forming, those ready to embrace change, and those holding on to skepticism. The tension was palpable, but it was the kind of tension that preceded meaningful transformation. As Jake stepped away from the microphone, the room erupted into a mix of applause and heated discussion. Some officers approached him with supportive handshakes, while community members gathered in small groups, debating the sincerity of his words. The evening had shifted from a planned event about inclusion to something more raw and immediate, a real-time experiment in the possibility of change and the price of redemption. After the event, David led Jake to his private office on the club's top floor. The space offered a stark contrast to the emotional intensity downstairs, all clean lines, soft lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline. David gestured to a leather chair while pouring 2 glasses of water, deliberately avoiding anything stronger. "Your speech wasn't planned," David stated, settling into his chair behind the desk. It wasn't a question, but an observation. Jake sat stiffly, still in his uniform. "No, sir. I've been attending these support group sessions, and something you said tonight about honest conversations, it just hit me. I had to speak." David studied him silently for a moment before reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a worn newspaper clipping from 20 years ago, a small article about a police officer fired for racial discrimination. The officer's name was Richard Thompson. "I did my research after our incident," David explained, sliding the article across the desk. "Your father's case was one of the reasons I bought my first club. I wanted to change the system from the inside." Jake stared at the article, his father's face looking back at him from the grainy photo. He never recovered from being fired, died bitter and angry 5 years ago, still blaming everyone but himself. "Tell me about growing up with him," David said, leaning back in his chair. For the next hour, Jake spoke about his childhood, about dinner table conversations filled with racist rhetoric disguised as experience and street smarts, about watching his father transform from a respected officer to an angry, isolated man, about inheriting not just a badge, but a whole worldview he'd never properly questioned. David listened intently, occasionally sharing his own stories, about building his business empire despite constant skepticism, about teaching his children how to handle discrimination with dignity, about the daily calculations of when to fight and when to educate. "The hardest part," David admitted, "is knowing that my success doesn't protect me. That night at the club entrance, I've experienced that same situation countless times, just wearing different suits in different places." Jake nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about how many times I've been that barrier for someone else. How many careers, relationships, or simple evenings out I might have damaged without even realizing it." "Awareness is the first step," David replied, "but it can't be the last." He pulled out a proposal he'd been working on, a comprehensive program for police community engagement. "I need someone who understands both sides of this divide, someone who's lived it and is willing to help bridge it." Jake reviewed the proposal, his police training kicking in as he analyzed the practical challenges and potential solutions. Together, they spent the next 2 hours refining the program, adding concrete steps for implementation and measurable outcomes. As midnight approached, they had the framework for something unprecedented, a partnership between law enforcement and the community that addressed both systemic issues and individual behaviors. The program would include regular forums, joint training sessions, and mentorship opportunities. "This won't be easy," David warned as they wrapped up. "You'll face resistance from both sides." Jake stood, squaring his shoulders. "I know, but I'm done being part of the problem. It's time to be part of the solution." Laura's article hit the front page of the New York Times digital edition at 6 a.m. From confrontation to collaboration. How one night of discrimination sparked a movement. Within hours, the story went viral, spawning thousands of social media shares and igniting fierce debates across platforms. The article began with a vivid description of the confrontation at the club entrance, but quickly expanded into a deeper exploration of systemic issues. Laura had masterfully woven together Jake's personal transformation, David's strategic response, and the larger implications for police-community relations. "What makes this story unique," Laura wrote, "isn't the initial act of discrimination. Sadly, such incidents occur daily. What's unprecedented is the response. A police officer publicly confronting his inherited biases while working with the very person he wronged to create institutional change. By mid-morning, news vans lined up outside both the precinct and the Capitol Club. David's phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from major networks, while Jake faced intense scrutiny from both supporters and critics within the department. The streets of New York became a canvas for public reaction. Outside the police headquarters, protesters gathered with signs reading, "No more excuses," and "Reform now." But unlike previous demonstrations, these protesters came with specific demands, directly inspired by the program David and Jake had proposed. Counter-protesters also appeared, some defending traditional policing methods, others arguing that the proposed changes didn't go far enough. The tension between groups was palpable, but the presence of community leaders trained in de-escalation helped maintain peace. At an hastily arranged press conference, Jake and David sat side by side, facing a battery of cameras and microphones. The contrast between them was striking. David in his impeccable suit, Jake in his uniform, but their unified message was clear. "This isn't about one incident or two individuals," David explained to the assembled press. "This is about addressing patterns of behavior that have divided our city for generations." Jake added, "We're not asking officers to stop doing their jobs. We're asking ourselves, to do those jobs better, with more awareness and genuine community engagement." The questions from reporters were relentless. "Officer Thompson, how do you respond to accusations that this is just damage control?" "Mr. Johnson, why work with the system instead of fighting it? How can you ensure real change when similar programs have failed?" Their responses, carefully coordinated but genuinely delivered, emphasized the practical steps they'd outlined: mandatory implicit bias training, community oversight committees, regular forums for dialogue, and concrete accountability measures. As the press conference concluded, social media exploded with new hashtags: NYPD change and bridging. The gap started trending nationally. Video clips of Jake's candid admissions about inherited prejudice went viral, sparking discussions about generational bias in law enforcement. The story had touched a nerve, offering something rare in the ongoing debate about police reform, a pathway forward that acknowledged past wrongs while creating concrete mechanisms for change. It wasn't just about punishing bad behavior anymore. It was about transforming the system from within. But beneath the media frenzy and public reaction, both men understood that the hard work was just beginning. The real test would come in the daily implementation of their ideas, in the resistance they'd face from both sides, and in their ability to maintain momentum once the cameras turned away. The press conference was winding down when Marcus Williams, a community activist from Harlem, rose from his seat. His voice cut through the general murmur of the room with laser precision. "Officer Thompson, let's talk about the Rivera case from 2019, Marcus announced, holding up a folder. The room fell silent. "You were part of the unit that seized over $50,000 in cash from a Latino-owned business without proper documentation. That money was never returned, even after the owners were cleared of all charges." The camera flashes intensified. Jake's face remained stoic, but his hands gripped the podium tighter. David, sitting nearby, watched the scene unfold with growing concern. "I have here," Marcus continued, "sworn statements from 3 business owners in the same district who experienced similar inspections from your unit. All minority-owned businesses, all involving cash seizures, all during your tenure." The allegations hit like thunderbolts. Reporters who had been packing up their equipment quickly resumed filming. Social media feeds that had been celebrating reform suddenly filled with new hashtags: corrupt cop and Yash fake reform. Jake's superior officers, watching the broadcast from headquarters, immediately initiated an internal investigation. By evening, Jake was placed on administrative leave pending review. The same cameras that had captured his redemption story now filmed him leaving the precinct, shield and gun surrendered. David faced his own crisis of conscience, his inbox flooded with messages from supporters urging him to distance himself from Jake and the program they'd developed. corporate sponsors threatened to withdraw their backing. The carefully constructed bridge between community and police seemed to be crumbling before it was even fully built. In his apartment that night, Jake sifted through old case files, his dining table covered with papers. The Rivera case hadn't been a simple mistake. It was part of a systematic operation run by his former sergeant, James Morrison. Jake had witnessed it, participated in it, rationalized it as aggressive policing. His phone buzzed with a message from David. "My office, tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have." The decision facing Jake was clear, but devastating. To prove his commitment to change, he would have to betray the code of silence that had governed his entire career. The thin blue line he'd been taught to protect would have to be crossed. His father's voice echoed in his head. The job comes first. But for the first time, Jake questioned what the job really was, to protect the system or to protect justice. David, meanwhile, faced questions from his board of directors. The program they'd announced was meant to build bridges, not expose corruption. Some argued for abandoning the initiative entirely, cutting losses before the scandal grew worse. But as David reviewed the press coverage, he saw something different. The public reaction wasn't purely negative. Many saw this as an opportunity to address not just individual prejudice, but systemic corruption. The Rivera case could be the key to demonstrating that real change required confronting all aspects of police misconduct. The next morning, as Jake walked into David's office carrying a box of files, both men understood they were about to cross a point of no return. The story had evolved from one of personal redemption to something far more complex, a test of whether true reform was possible in a system built on layers of protection and silence. Jake spent the next week methodically documenting everything he knew about the corruption within his former unit. Working from a small conference room in David's office building, he created detailed timelines, compiled witness statements, and mapped connections between supposedly unrelated incidents. The pattern emerged clearly. Sergeant Morrison had orchestrated a sophisticated scheme targeting minority-owned businesses. The unit would conduct routine inspections, find minor violations, then offer to resolve the issues unofficially in exchange for cash. Business owners who refused faced endless harassment and bureaucratic obstacles. At 2 a.m. one morning, while reviewing security footage from the precinct, Jake discovered something that made his blood run cold. The camera caught Morrison meeting with several high-ranking officers, including Deputy Commissioner Roberts. The corruption went higher than anyone had suspected. They were all in on it, Jake told David during their daily briefing. The seizures, the cover-ups, the selective enforcement, it was departmental policy disguised as individual actions. David listened intently, taking notes. This explains why previous reform attempts failed. They were targeting symptoms, not the disease. Jake's former colleagues began reaching out, some with threats, others with pleas. Officer Rodriguez, from his support group, visited him privately. "They're watching you, Jake," Rodriguez warned. "Morrison has friends everywhere. This morning, I overheard him talking about how accidents happen to officers who can't keep quiet." The threat was clear, but it only strengthened Jake's resolve. He'd spent years being part of the problem. Now he had a chance to help fix it. David hired private security for both of them. He'd faced corporate takeover attempts before, but this was different. They weren't just fighting for control of a business, but for the soul of law enforcement itself. During a late-night strategy session, Jake received an encrypted email from an anonymous source within the department. It contained internal memos documenting how the corrupt practices had been systematically covered up for years. "Look at these dates," Jake pointed out to David. "Every time there was a discrimination complaint, they'd manufacture a drug bust or gang arrest in the same neighborhood. They weren't just stealing money. They were manipulating public perception." David added this new information to their growing case file. We need to be strategic about how we release this. If we move too fast, they'll bury it. Too slow, and they'll have time to cover their tracks. The decision to come forward meant Jake had to sever ties with virtually everyone he'd known in law enforcement. His former partners stopped speaking to him. The police union withdrew its support. Even officers who privately agreed with him maintained their public silence. One evening, as Jake was leaving David's office, he noticed he was being followed. Instead of going home, he drove to the precinct where it had all started. In the parking lot, he found Morrison waiting. "You could have been set for life," Morrison said, stepping out of the shadows. "We took care of our own." "That was the problem," Jake replied. "We only took care of our own." The confrontation ended without violence, but the message was clear. The old guard wouldn't go down without a fight. As Jake drove away, he realized that his journey from prejudiced officer to whistleblower wasn't just about personal redemption anymore. It was about exposing a system that had turned protection into oppression. The press conference room at City Hall was packed beyond capacity. News outlets from across the globe had gathered, sensing that this wasn't just another police reform announcement. Jake and David sat at the central table, surrounded by their legal team and independent investigators. Behind them, a massive screen displayed a simple message: transparency, accountability. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same room where countless police commissioners had defended standard procedures would now expose those procedures' corrupt foundations. Commissioner Martinez entered just before the scheduled start, his face grave. He'd been briefed on what was coming and had chosen, after lengthy deliberation, to stand with the reformers rather than defend the old guard. David spoke first, his voice steady. "3 months ago, I was denied entry to my own club because of the color of my skin. Today, we're here to show that incident was just the tip of an iceberg of systemic corruption and discrimination." Jake then took the podium, looking older than he had just months before. "What I'm about to share will end my career in law enforcement, but staying silent would end something more important: the possibility of real change." The presentation began with the security footage they'd discovered. On screen, Deputy Commissioner Roberts could be clearly seen accepting envelopes from Sergeant Morrison. Their conversation about handling the minority situation picked up by enhanced audio. The room erupted as Jake methodically presented evidence of years of targeted harassment, illegal seizures, and coordinated cover-ups. Reporters frantically took notes as he showed how the department had systematically protected corrupt officers while punishing those who spoke up. Then came the moment that changed everything. A video began playing. Morrison in his office, recorded just days earlier on his own phone and leaked by a sympathetic officer. In it, he bragged about how they'd keep David in his place, despite his wealth and influence. "These people need to learn," Morrison's voice rang through the speakers, "that no amount of money changes who they are. Johnson thinks he's different. We'll remind him he's just another—" The racial slur that followed caused audible gasps. David stood, his composure unshaken. "This isn't about revenge. This is about breaking a cycle of corruption that has poisoned law enforcement and community relations for generations." Commissioner Martinez then announced immediate actions. Morrison and Roberts were suspended pending criminal investigation. A civilian oversight committee would be established with real power to investigate complaints. Most significantly, an independent audit of all minority-owned business interactions with the department over the past decade would begin immediately. The press conference stretched for hours as reporter after reporter asked for details, clarifications, and follow-up. But the real story wasn't just in the revelations. It was in the unprecedented alliance between a wronged business owner and a reformed officer, working together to create genuine change. As the day ended, Jake and David stood together outside City Hall, watching as their revelations sent shockwaves through the city. Protest groups were already gathering, but this time with signs supporting reform rather than just demanding it. Police officers who had privately opposed corruption began stepping forward with their own stories. "This is just the beginning," David said quietly. Jake nodded, touching the space where his badge had been. "But it's a real beginning this time.